Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of faith for our messy lives. I'm Tony Kolenc, a professor at Ave Maria School of Law, the father of 5 grown children, and the author of inspirational fiction for teens and adults. I'm very excited because my first installment in the trilogy Incarnate is coming out from Chrism Press, kind of an out there speculative fiction series with the premise of what would happen if some diabolical organization were to clone the Eucharistic miracle in order to clone Jesus himself. And what would happen if you were the person who found out that allegedly you were this clone? And the chaos ensues from there. So from Chrism Press, just really excited for it coming out. But today I'll be speaking with Dan Mahoney about dealing with the stages of grief through poetry. My guest today is Dan Mahoney. He's a father, a husband, a poet. He likes to write about beauty and the simplicities of life and gives voice to the experience of grief through a 5-volume set of poetry called A Dear Friend. Volume 1, Denial, is already released, and the others are going to be forthcoming from En Route Media. Dan seeks to increase the awareness of grief, and he calls people to encounter our Lord amidst their sorrows. He's a practicing Catholic in the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin, where he lives with his wife and 2 boys. Dan, welcome to the Shepherd's Pie.
Tony, thanks for having me.
So Dan, tell us a little bit about your background, how you wound up a place where you would be writing poetry.
Yeah, so I live here in Madison, Wisconsin. I work for a software company, entry-level sales right now. But 5 years ago now, I lost my father after a 2-year fight with pancreatic cancer. And shortly after that, I began to discover poetry as a means to not only cope with that grief, but also a way to encounter the Lord that like I never had before. Writing these poems was a great experience for me, and just super blessed that those poems are now being published. And hopefully I can help some people who are also struggling with grief to encounter the Lord in all of that as well.
I'm very sorry for your loss, by the way, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that. Were you writing poetry as part of your life prior to this, or was this you tackling poetry for the first time?
Looking back on my life, I could see there was different tones that I was like, I feel like that was poetry that I was kind of seeking there, but it really didn't come to fruition until after my dad died. And what I've kind of been telling people is that I didn't really find poetry, it found me. And I really feel like the Lord gave it as a gift to me to encounter him through it. And so I feel very blessed to have poetry in my life, and it's something that I really hold dear.
Well, listen, hey, before you tell us about the loss of your dad, I actually would like to hear a little bit about your dad. What was he like? Tell us some of your thoughts and memories of him.
He was very straight-laced. So he had 9 brothers. He was the second oldest and grew up on the family farm. So he never really lost that. For me growing up, we were always a chore to do. It was in his blood, and so it was in our bones as well. He was strong. He was courageous. He had high expectations, not only for me, for the family, but for himself as well. And I think the biggest thing that I'll say about him is that whenever he was around, we knew that things were safe. We always knew that whatever crisis may come or would come, that dad would take care of it. Yeah, I definitely felt that vacancy once he left. That safety spurred a lot of different types of anxiety. But yeah, and I think he was very well respected in his own community. But going back to the title of these volumes, to me, he was just always a dear friend. And I'm the youngest of my family, and so when my siblings finally moved out of the house, it was such a beautiful time. I felt like for me to connect one-on-one with him. And so I always felt like I had a special bond with him. And yeah, I miss him every day. So when he was diagnosed, I was 20 years old. So right in kind of in the middle of college there. He was about 67 when he first got diagnosed, and then passed away 2 years later. But he was always, this is another thing about him, he never really looked his age, always looked young. He was really in shape. He loved to bike ride all the time. I guess it depends on people's perspective if 67 is young or old, but he always looked very much younger than that. And he was, I think, secretly young at heart, and even in his strong expectations.
Now, was there a kind of a spiritual component to your relationship with your dad? Was he one of the influences on your life growing up in the faith?
Yeah, for sure. He grew up in a Catholic household. So growing up, he was, yeah, we did rosaries in the car. He made sure I was trained at a young age as an altar server. And so I really do accredit my faith as his torch that he passed to me, and it obviously developed over time. But I think that's probably one of the things I'm most grateful for. And one thing I strive to do in my own family is how can I pass that torch of faith that he gave me so beautifully onto to my boys as well. And yeah, I think just looking back, right, you look back at your father and you see all the ways that he formed you that you weren't aware of growing up.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, as a parent, I'm a father of five myself. I kind of wish that my kids would think that about me one day. So it's
Yeah.
nice to know that that your dad was actually that guy. So you were in college when he found out about the cancer, and it sounds like it worked quickly, 2 years. Were you having to be near to him when he was ill, or were you separated? Could tell us a little bit about that time.
Yeah, so I was actually serving on Net Ministries, and I was actually down in Naples, Florida. It was about 2 weeks before I was scheduled to come home, is when he called me and told me about the diagnosis. And there were some warning signs a couple months earlier. It was half expected, but when I found out the news, I felt like my whole world just kind of crumbled. So I quickly came home, and I was working at a summer camp the year before and was kind of intending to go back. And so that summer, I kind of split the time trying to figure out, my parents were very gracious, wanting to make sure that my life didn't come to a halt, being in the middle of college and making sure I was still on track, but then still feeling like I wanted to help out. So I did a lot of split time there. And I think the biggest factor too is I just started a relationship with my wife, that girlfriend, Molly, at that time. And so it was definitely a struggle of like, we did long distance for that year while I was in Naples. And so I was excited to come back and be with her and start that relationship. And then my dad gets diagnosed, and it just kind of it was a really big mess. And so I ended up going to a college semi close to home in Grand Rapids to kind of, I figured, halfway between each. But then I ended up transferring to Wisconsin. So I bounced around a lot, and it was definitely a really rough 2 years trying to figure everything out.
Now, did you start writing your poetry during that time, or was it only after the loss of your dad that you really came to poetry?
Yeah, I would say it was after for sure. I remember actually sitting in my apartment and just feeling this heaviness and kind of this isolation. I just picked up a pen and had some paper, and I remember that first poem I wrote, and it was really an expression of the darkness that I was feeling, the heaviness that I was feeling. And I remember after writing it, I felt like I could breathe. I felt like I had just kind of like a weight was semi lifted. There was a lot of weight, so even a little bit, right? But yeah, so it wasn't until after, but yeah, once that first poem started, really, I just couldn't stop. It was something that I just had to keep doing. Yeah, that relief I felt.
How many poems would you say you've written on this particular issue of grieving for your father's loss?
I'd say in total, I've written somewhere near 100 that will all be in the collective 5 volumes. I still am writing poetry here and there. So I've got, maybe 150 or so that I've written over the years, but something that I wish I did more, finding the time and the disciplines.
It's really interesting. So your collection from En route Media is called A Dear Friend. Volume 1 is labeled Denial. And I know you are clearly channeling the Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. So can you address real quick, just for people who might not be familiar with that theory of grieving, what are these 5 stages real quick?
Yeah, the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And the idea is that you go through these, I'll call them different emotions and kind of states of being, right? Denial, obviously, being like you can't really understand the world that now has changed for you. And so, in some senses, you act like it either didn't happen or refuse to believe that it did in some way. Anger, obviously, you're just the injustice you feel that was done to you feels like it can never be repaid. Bargaining is more like, what would you do to get that person back in your life, right? What would you pay? What would you do? And then you move into depression, where it's just I think it's really like right the eve of acceptance where you are like starting to realize that this is for real and this is the rest of your life, right? And that's obviously can be a depressing feeling. And then obviously acceptance, right? You see the beauty of the life that you have before you, even with this great loss, and you start to see the gifts amidst all the pain and really how the Lord has redeemed it.
That's a really beautiful description. You probably described it better than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross could have described it herself, because you're doing it sort of through the eyes of faith and the eyes of somebody who's lived it. Yeah, I lost my father also when I was younger than you were. I was 12 years old, and
Oh
he
wow.
was 57 and died of a heart attack
Yeah.
after 5 years of, it was a second heart attack. So,
Wow.
but yeah, no, as you describe those five stages, I was just reflecting back. I mean, at my age, you go through a lot of different losses in your life. So my father was just probably the first of
Hmm.
them. But, I was thinking as you were talking and imagining what was it like for me as a kid going through. And,
Yeah.
I think you're right. You kind of hit each of those stages there. So let's take a deeper dive then into each of these stages because you've written poetry about them. Maybe if you could describe a little bit about why you feel like poetry is something that, at least for you, was useful in dealing with grief.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I honestly, I ask myself that a lot because it's like everyone has their own coping mechanisms and some are healthy and some are not. Why did poetry kind of fall into my lap there? And I'm really grateful for it. I mentioned before that I felt like it found me. There's a quote by Dostoevsky that's often repeated. He says, "Beauty will save the world." And that really resonates with me because I do feel like poetry is a pursuit of beauty. You're trying to describe something that's indescribable. And when I look at my life, looking back, right, when I was 20 years old and then 22, I see kind of two paths before me. I see myself heading maybe towards despair and then myself maybe heading towards hope. It was beauty that kept me from despair. I fell in love with beautiful things, and it was through beauty that I was able to just sit, rest, heal. It was a good reminder for me that God is good. In A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis writes, I didn't doubt that God existed. I doubted that he was good. Obviously, that resonated with me a lot because there were so many times where like, I know God is good. And I know like, right, all the teachings of who God is. And God might be good to everybody else, but he doesn't really feel like he's good to me. And so if he was, this wouldn't have happened, right? That kind of line of thinking. And it was really beauty that allowed me to see, no, God is good and he's seeking me through this. And I can't understand why this happened in my life, and I'm not going to try to. But when I see a beautiful sunset or hear a beautiful hymn, those are just good reminders for me that God is good and he's seeking me. I may not like the way he's doing it right now, or especially in that circumstance, but I'm willing to stay with him, I guess.
Hearing you talk, it makes me wonder if you wound up going through this grief alone. Because a lot of times when we grieve, I know for my own life, there's been a few times where I've been able to grieve with members of my family, and there was a lot of comfort and bonding that went in through that process. Can you speak to that for a minute?
The one beautiful thing, many beautiful things, I guess, that came out of my dad's passing is I do feel like it made our family stronger and closer knit. There were moments where I did feel like I was grieving alone. And honestly, most of that was my own doing. I kind of started to push everything away and everyone away. And hence the denial, right? I didn't want to encounter the pain. And so there was a real turning point, I think, though, particularly with me and my mom. Yeah, we were able to share honestly about how we were doing. We were able to grow stronger in that. And then, especially too, with my siblings and, with my brother, right? Like him and I have this kind of shared, it's our father. It's like our bones are his bones, and so we still talk to this day about like, yeah, what would dad do in this situation and things like that. And that's just been beautiful. And yeah, obviously with my sister as well. And it grew us tighter. And I honestly too, like there were definitely challenges along the way, but I do think we're still growing closer. And it was that experience that helped us do that.
All right, so let's hit each of these stages in relation to your poetry. Can you give us a little bit on denial? Your whole first volume is on denial. So how many poems do you have in there about denial? And can you share some of the flavor of some of these and some of your experience with that?
Yeah. So with denial, you're running. I feel like I was running away. What I did in that is I just acted like whatever this traumatic experience was just didn't happen. And so I didn't talk about it with my friends. I didn't try to bring it up with obviously my family. And the more those emotions just started to I just pushed them down, it felt like, and just kind of turned away. And so denial, when I started writing these poems, I felt like it was the Lord inviting me to encounter my heart again, but I wasn't maybe ready to fully step into those deep waters. And so really they're just like a toe dipping in the water. Just kind of some introductions, starting to just kind of enter that space of grief, encountering my own denial, right? Saying to myself, you've been running from this too long. It's time we start digging in.
So your poems on denial, I mean, especially now in hindsight, as you look back at them, where was God in that and in your poetry? Was he kind of absent because of the denial?
I think when I first started writing it, it was kind of like the Lord saying, I've been absent too long. And so he's starting to creep a little bit more in. And I think the more I think about it, it's almost like an introduction to beauty from my own personal experience, right? So I started to see things that were beautiful and just wanted to write about them. Maybe it was like a poem about George Washington crossing the Delaware, right? That kind of beautiful, heroic moment of American history, or maybe it is a beautiful sunset or beautiful poem about the creation of Adam or something like that. And so there's kind of hints of it coming in. And I think it's more of like the Lord saying, there's a beauty in this life you still have available. But he didn't press his hand too much. He just wanted me to see the beauty. And then later on, I could realize that it was him.
All right, so denial will often evolve into anger. Maybe share a little bit about your experience with anger and especially in your poetry.
Yeah, I think denial is a great segue into anger because as I'm starting to push all these feelings down, those feelings don't want to stay dormant, right? So they start to ooze out the sides, it feels like. So I'm pressing down on them and they're just kind of coming out in kind of sideways ways, maybe unhealthy ways. But so how that kind of translated into poetry, I remember that period of my life. The way I describe it is I felt like my blood was always at the brink of boil. I remember just being really angry. Yeah, I could just feel my teeth grinding. When I look back and read those poems, I can feel my kind of muscles tense. And I think ultimately, right, what's the good in that and where's the Lord in that? I think it was just him giving me space to finally start to bring those emotions to the surface and realizing how unhealthy of a space I was, where if I would continue down this path of just not letting my emotions and letting my humanity come to the forefront, then I'm just going to be down a path of anguish, really. So, yeah.
So I'm curious, when you look back at these poems on denial and anger, especially, did you see, because now you're looking back after getting to acceptance, do you see the other stages in any way kind of formulating in those poems, or are you really sort of writing them from a stage where it's just anger I'm dealing with now, or something like that?
Yeah, I think, but I just remember being just angry. Like I'm just angry all the time. And then maybe I could see that kind of segueing into bargaining where, well, I wouldn't be so angry if things could just be what they used to be. What would I do, right? Maybe putting that energy of anger towards like trying to be productive and trying to say, okay, what would I do to have him back in my life? And I remember going just kind of go briefly into bargaining. There was like a point in my life. I recently, after he passed, I got married within a year, and I remember thinking that I had to do everything my dad did. I had to like make sure I had this amount of money. I make sure it was kind of set in stages, and I really didn't leave room for the Lord to chart His plan for my life. I just wanted to live what my dad's life was because I knew it was safe. But so I think there's kind of a sense of bargaining there of like, well, if I just lived the way he did, he would still be in my life to some capacity. And that took me a long time to unravel and just to say his life was his. I'm grateful for the effect that he had in my life. The Lord has a different plan for me.
So yeah, bargaining. I guess that's still kind of a form of denial. You're not ready to throw in the towel yet. Maybe there's still somehow a way. But how does that translate? When you've lost somebody to death, obviously, what does bargaining look like when somebody is passed? I mean, because obviously you're not thinking you're somehow going to be able to get them back at that
Right.
point.
Yeah, I think doing everything you can to try to keep his memory alive, even in rational and irrational ways. Just thinking of my life in particular, wanting to hang on to every single thing that he owned, trying to make sure I save like all the pictures, and but then ultimately knowing like no, there is nothing that will bring him back. And I think that's probably what segues into depression. But yeah, just holding on. You're just hanging on it. And I liked how you said that, there's this little sense of denial in there. And I think, right, we think of these things as kind of linear, but I think they all kind of play on each other, right? Yeah, it's like you're just like right at the brink of giving it one last shot to see it. Okay, you're really asking yourself, is this the life forward now? So, and then that obviously leads into depression.
Yeah, so talk about that then. Did you write some poems when you were in that stage of depression, and how long did that last for you?
Yeah, depression was a long stage, and it was a real carver in terms of how deep it dwelled in me and the places that it created inside. Just myself going from bargaining, finally realizing like this is it. I have to figure out my life now without a dad. I have to get married, I have to raise a kid, I have to buy a house. I've got to make sure I have to do all those things. It's a beautiful time looking back when you're in it. Yeah, it's really hard to explain. And I think that's why when I think of my poetry, I really do connect it with my own sense of depression. Because to other people, it's like, well, if you're bummed out, just do this or just do that. But you don't realize how deep it dwells. And so just giving voice to it, honestly, just learning how to cry was a big thing for me. Sometimes as men, we don't often like to share our emotions, particularly in front of others. But then I think for me, in front of myself, I remember like having a desire to cry, but then like, yeah, not knowing either how to, or I'm like, no, I don't do this. I got to stay strong, which, yeah, in some cases that might be true. But I think knowing how to be sorrowful, and the real beautiful part is it's just a great segue into the life of Christ and the life of our Blessed Mother, and connecting with her on a real level when I use this term lightly, kind of on the brink of despair, and knowing that there is a companion with you in the darkness and he's been there before. And you have a real choice to make, right? When you're in the thralls of depression, like I kind of mentioned before, there's a path towards despair and there's a path towards hope. And with my experience, I'm just grateful the Lord gave me a path to hope. I'm grateful to my wife too. Dealing with somebody who's depressed is not easy, and so I really am grateful for my wife just being heroic and knowing how to serve me in that, and to my mother and my siblings as well. Yeah, those poems, right? Kind of going back to the poetry, I think those are some of my favorite poems. They can be a bit dark and depressing, but that's the stage. So.
So let me ask this. You mentioned earlier in the interview that, seeing beauty, is so important. Beauty will save the world. You quoted Dostoevsky. When you are looking at these different poems and these different stages, where do you see the beauty?
Yeah, I think particularly with depression, you start to sense a deepness that the Lord is carving in you, and it's really painful. And you don't know what's happening, you don't know why it's happening. But out of those depths, if you can feel that deeply, you can also feel joy that deeply. And you start to not rely on happiness as much. And so people talk about the difference between happiness and joy, right? Happiness is this fleeting emotion, but joy kind of is a rock. And you start to really figure out what joy means. And that doesn't mean you have to be laughing all day. It means you have the hope of Christ in you, and that whatever weather comes, you can brave it, because he's with you. And I think that was a big gift that the Lord gave me, was he has established a place in my heart that's only his, that he carved for himself. And it was a painful experience, but I am glad that he did it. And he continues to carve places in our hearts, albeit however painful it may be. The beauty that I get to see in the world, and I get to find joy in the kind of simple beauties of life today. It's kind of a beautiful sunrise. It means all the more to me, I feel like. And having a family I get to see that beauty every day. And the little stages that my kids grow through, and they're just truly beautiful to me, and I wouldn't trade it anywhere for the world. And I don't know how grateful or appreciative I would be of the beauty, not only, yeah, in the world, but in my life if I had not experienced kind of the deep thralls of depression.
That leads us to acceptance. And, compared to the other four, I suppose acceptance sounds like it should be awesome.
Yeah.
Is acceptance a happy, joyful stage, or is it something other than that?
Yeah, I would say it's more of a peace. Accept the terms. You accept the path that the Lord has for you. You start to see the beauty in it. The Lord gives you a hint of understanding. You still obviously have questions, and honestly, acceptance is sometimes something you have to choose. There's a lot of anguish in the previous four. Acceptance are those little windows of, everything is okay, and this maybe isn't what I had planned it to be, but I'm okay with it now. And I'm okay with the journey that the Lord has brought me through. And yeah, and then you really accept his will, right? That's really, I feel like, what it is, because I don't think anybody would choose it, right? To experience grief or to lose somebody. I don't think anybody would ever choose that. And so you finally accept the thing that the Lord chose for you.
I suppose if everybody can identify with this, because we all have experienced loss in different ways in our lives, and I'm sure your words were resonating with a lot of people. If people are interested in getting a hold of Volume 1, Denial, and possibly when Volume 2 comes out, hopefully in the near future, and then the others, where would you like them to go to find all this information on you and your writing?
Yeah, so there's two spots. I'd say the first spot, I just have a Substack. It's called simplybeautiful.substack.com. And in there, there's also a link to Enroute, booksandmedia.com under their poetry section. You can find me there too. So it's a Dear Friend, Volume 1, Denial by Daniel Mahoney.
Beautiful. Well, Dan, it has been great having you on the Shepherd's Pie today and sharing your story and your journey on through grief.
No, I appreciate it, Tony. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the show today. We've been speaking with Dan Mahoney about the stages of grief and how he was able to use poetry to really help cope and get him through those various stages. Again, this is Antony Barone Kolenc, and you can find out more about me, about my books, all at my website, antonykolenc.com. But until next time, may God bless us as we rely on our faith to work through the messy challenges of our lives.